100%. Eli Matthewson, thank you very much. Have a great Friday. Eli still has one show that's not sold out, so do go along. Is that right, Eli?
Tomorrow night.
Good on you.
Theatre.
And speaking of Dunedin, speaking of noise control, turn this up loud. It saved my life. Bye bye. See ya.
Don't you try to save my life. I'm already dead. Don't you try to save my life. I'm already dead. Don't you try to save my life. I'm already dead. Don't you try to save my life. I'm already dead.
Kei te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere ake nei, you might get to buy a slice of the All Blacks for as little as $100. But the plan from the Players Association has infuriated New Zealand Rugby and prompted cries of half-baked puffery, selfishness and greed. We've got the details of the deal eating at Rugby. A warning from the Transport Minister to get out of your cars before we become a dumping ground for other countries' dirty vehicles. Why New Zealand needs to move quickly so it doesn't lose its COVID crown. And as the debate about public servant salaries rages, we take a little peek at their bosses' big pay packets. And the end of a satirical era. Tributes flow for comedy icon David McPhail, who died this morning.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The country's biggest nurses union says strike action is inevitable unless the district health boards urgently revise their paltry pay offer. DHBs say their offer is fair and reasonable as it comes on top of a 16% pay rise in 2018. However, a spokesperson for the nurses' organisation, David Waite, says it is not acceptable to its 30,000 members working in DHBs who have voted to strike next month.
It's less than the rate of inflation for most of our members, and it undervalues the work that they do. What's more, it does nothing to aid recruitment or retention, and we've already started to see members heading to Australia since the bubble opened.
David Waite says he hopes DHBs will front with a better offer at mediation early next week. Otherwise, the strike action will go ahead on June 9th. New Zealand Rugby is accusing the Players Association of sabotaging its proposed deal with US private equity firm Silver Lake. The Players Association and investment company Forsyth Barr are proposing an alternative deal that the NZR sell a 5% stake in its commercial rights via a public share float, compared to the 12.5% the Silver Lake deal involves. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
Forsyth Barr estimate a share float would raise $191 million, and while that's nearly $200 million less than the Silver Lake deal, the investment firm and the Players Association maintain the new proposal has much longer-term benefits. But NZR's Chief Executive Mark Robinson says the Players Association is trying to destroy the Silver Lake deal by publicly releasing the proposal rather than sharing it with them first. He says the proposal includes confidential information they haven't consented to being made public, which is a breach of trust. Robinson says they have no desire to play out an ill-informed "my model is better than yours" debate, and he fears the Silver Lake deal could now be lost. This is Stephen Hewson.
A judge has said he didn't accept an elderly Matamata man's explanation that his wife wanted to die in a suicide pact. 82-year-old Roy Morton has been given 4.5 months home detention for the attempted murder of his 81-year-old wife after 2 failed suicide attempts in October last year. His wife had earlier suffered a debilitating stroke. Justice Davison said the claim didn't match medical advice.
The assessment found that Mrs Morton had difficulties retaining and understanding information, had significant difficulties communicating, and was unable to display signs of reasoning. She was assessed as being significantly vulnerable to exploitation.
Justice Davison set a starting point of 18 months jail but gave discounts for the guilty plea and Morton's age, health and remorse. There's renewed hope that one of Whakatane's biggest companies will be saved. It was announced earlier this year that the Whakatane mill would close at the end of June. It's a key employer in the region and many other businesses are dependent upon it. The Eastern Bay of Plenty Economic Development Agency says the mill's owners, SIG, are in negotiations with the company Smurfit to buy the mill. However, it is recommending caution until the final acquisition has been completed. A North Canterbury brewer who made racist comments on a social media post about family violence has said he is extremely sorry for his comments. David Gawn from Eagle Brewing posted a comment on a news website describing Māori as the scourge of New Zealand and said the quicker they were put in prison, the better. His comment has led to some retailers pulling his products from their stores. David Gawn has apologised for his comments and says he was lashing out after reading articles about family violence.
I'm extremely sorry to the public of New Zealand. The comments as they came across were absolutely unacceptable, totally inappropriate, and they're not comments I would normally put out there.
David Gawn says he will take action to better understand his own bias. It's 5:04. New Zealand and Australia will revive Super Rugby as an international affair when the Trans-Tasman competition kicks off in Dunedin and Sydney tonight. The Highlanders host Super Rugby Australia champions, the Queensland Reds, while the Hurricanes play the Waratahs in Sydney. The bookies, though, give the Reds little chance of winning the tournament, in fact rating the Super Rugby Aotearoa Wooden Spooners the Hurricanes a better chance. However, Queensland coach and World Cup winning All Black Brad Thorne believes the pundits and bookmakers can be proved wrong.
We're all about embracing that, and we like to think we have some good stuff going on too. So we know that we won't be highly rated in New Zealand. I guess we'll see.
The Highlanders-Reds game kicks off at 7:05. Liverpool have come from behind to beat Manchester United 4-2 and boost their chances at a Champions League place. British rivals Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua have agreed on August 14th date for their World Heavyweight Unification title fight in Saudi Arabia. The Canberra Raiders Rugby League coach Ricky Stewart has been forced to apologise after saying if he couldn't have tough conversations with his players, he may as well coach netball. The comment sparked outrage from the netball community, with former Australian international saying the comment was ignorant and Stewart didn't realise how tough netball was. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, New Zealander Guy Kosher is an Everest guide, but he says COVID's too big a risk this season as hundreds rush to the mountain. Joshua Rivera on what it's like waiting for the rapture. Terrifying, it turns out. And the author of The Big Short, Michael Lewis, with a new book about what he calls the heroic rogue patriots of the pandemic. Paul Kim Hillaho. Join me tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Cloud increasing, a few showers in Northland, then rain with heavy falls spreading east overnight, becoming mainly fine tomorrow morning or afternoon. For the remainder of the North Island, high cloud increasing, rain for most tomorrow morning, mainly fine after that, but isolated showers in the west until tomorrow night. For Marlborough and Nelson, mainly fine tonight, rain with heavy falls developing, then clearing tomorrow morning. Bulla to Fiordland, also Southland and Clutha mainly fine. Drizzle about Fiordland, rain with heavy falls developing everywhere tonight, easing to a few showers tomorrow morning. For the remainder of Otago and Canterbury mainly fine, but scattered rain tonight and tomorrow morning, a few showers around eastern Otago tomorrow evening. Chatham Islands, a few showers, a period of rain tomorrow afternoon and evening. RNZ National at 5:07.
Thanks, Susanna. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. New Zealand Rugby is accusing the Players Association of trying to sabotage its deal with US private equity firm Silver Lake. A Players Association proposal put together by investment firm Forsyth Barr suggests selling a 5% stake in NZR's commercial rights to the New Zealand public. The Players Association believe the approach is far better than the proposed Silver Lake deal, which they're refusing to sign off on. But NZR aren't happy. Chief Executive Mark Robinson shocked and disappointed at what he's calling a fundamental breach of trust. Clay Wilson with more on the intensifying dispute over New Zealand rugby's future.
Total nothing, no! The Players Association's latest challenge to the Silver Lake deal hasn't gone down well at New Zealand Rugby HQ. NZR boss Mark Robinson didn't hold back in his swift written response to the new proposal.
We are shocked and disappointed that Rob Nichol has shared another counter-proposal with media before sharing it with New Zealand Rugby. It includes confidential information about our organisation that we have not consented to being made public. This is a fundamental breach of trust and the partnership which up until now we'd valued highly. Through doing this, the NZRPA leadership has unilaterally taken a decision to attempt to destroy the Silver Lake deal.
Silver Lake have offered NZR almost $400 million for a 12.5% stake in a newly created commercial entity. The country's 26 provincial unions and the Māori Rugby Board have agreed to the deal, but it also needs approval from the Players Association. Prior to last month's NZR AGM, Chairman Brent Impey offered his thoughts on their refusal to give the green light.
If this deal doesn't proceed because of the stance taken by the Players Association, it'll be the biggest own goal in the history of New Zealand sport, and I believe that.
But the Players Association aren't budging. Their latest alternative involves selling shares in NZR's commercial operation to the public and listing them on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. Investors would have the chance to own up to 5% of those shares, with NZR continuing to own the balance. Players Association President, former All Black World Cup winning captain and Forsyth Bar Chairman David Kirk says NZR are obligated to look at the new proposal.
What I think we have done is provided them with much more certainty and much more clarity about the nature of this deal. Now, I think it would be very hard for them to say, oh, we are just not going to consider this, because there's a lot of detail about it now and there's a lot of confidence that it can be executed. And very importantly, the valuation's higher. And so if you're a director of a company and someone comes along and says, I can help you raise money at a higher valuation, I think you've got an obligation to look at that.
Kirk believes using the forecasts provided to them by NZR, the Silver Lake deal brings a high level of financial risk to NZR.
One of the biggest concerns with the Silver Lake deal is New Zealand Rugby are selling 12.5% of their revenue forever. And if you think about that, if you sell 12.5% of your revenue and keep 100% of your costs, you're going to have an unprofitable business. And that's what that Silver Lake deal shows. Certainly New Zealand Rugby is not profitable out to 2025, which is the end of their forecasts. But if you only sell 5% and retain 95%, then you can have a profitable operating business.
The proposal would match the $39 million promised to the provinces and the New Zealand Māori Rugby Board under the Silver Lake deal. But at least one provincial union is unconvinced, in fact downright opposed. Northland Rugby Union Chair Andrew Ritchie says the players' proposal is puffery, half-baked and a distraction from the much better Silver Lake deal. So what do investors think? Greg Smith, the head of research for Fat Profits, says the offer sounds good.
Oh, look, I think it's a great idea. It's at a premium to the existing offer on the table from Silver Lake and for a lower share of the revenue stream going forward. Of course, obviously a great way of sort of keeping it Kiwi, as it were.
Mark Lister, head of private wealth research, says the proposal is worth exploring.
I think it's certainly worth considering. You think about the All Blacks as a brand and certainly some of those sort of revenue generating parts of the organisation. I think a lot of New Zealand investors, both big and small, would be very interested.
For their part, New Zealand Rugby aren't commenting yet on the specifics of the new proposal, Mark Robinson claiming they need more time to understand the details. It appears any end to this heated stalemate over our national game is some way off. For Checkpoint, Clay Wilson.
So you might be able to buy a slice of the All Blacks for as little as $100, according to the investment firm behind the alternative proposal from the Rugby Players Association. As you heard, the plan would see 5% of New Zealand Rugby's commercial arm sold off via a public listing on the stock exchange, meaning you, grandma, fire, your cousins and neighbours could all own a slice. The Forsyth Bar proposal values NZR's commercial assets at up to 23% higher than the US investment company Silver Lake, Lake, and they claim its plan carries less risk. Here's Forsyth Bar Managing Director Neil Pavia-Smith's elevator pitch for the proposal.
This is an opportunity for New Zealand Rugby to retain a greater proportion of the ownership of their commercial revenues into the future. Alongside that, giving all New Zealanders an opportunity to own a slice of New Zealand Rugby is a really attractive investment proposition. New Zealand Rugby gets to distribute the funds to provincial unions and invest in the commercial company capitalisation as it has proposed under the Silver Lake deal. And after all of that, under this proposal, still have reserves in the order of $150 million. So we think it puts New Zealand Rugby in a far stronger position than the alternative.
So what demand are you forecasting, and where do you think it would come from if there was to be a share float?
Firstly, we think there'll be a really strong interest from a number of fund managers in New Zealand. So these are your professional investors, the likes of Kiwisaver schemes and so on. The second large group of investors is sort of a traditional investor audience. These are people who invest regularly through firms like Forsyth Bar and others, and the wealth management networks that are out there. And we anticipate there'd be strong interest from that group as well. And then a third, and this is perhaps a hard one to assess, but we think could be very significant, and that's the public. So we've suggested that one way of looking at this would be to have a minimum investment size as low as $100 per investor, so that it could reach, far and wide, be as accessible as possible. And so difficult to put an accurate sort of number in terms of what that public component of demand could be, but it could be very substantial.
In terms of sort of ma and pa investors, you're saying what? That they would only have to spend $100 to get a piece of the All Blacks?
So, yes, that's our advice, is that they set a minimum investment size of, say, $100. So you make this really accessible to a widespread audience of rugby supporters and the general public. Now, that's a little bit novel. Maybe that's too low, but it's just an idea we had to harness, interest and demand right down into the community roots of the game and so on. And so when we add up three pools of demand, our advice was that there could be demand in the range of sort of $400 to $650 million for an offering in size around 170, 180 million in size. So, much more demand than what would be available with 5%, but that's not unusual. You do get those situations. And I have to say, Lisa, in the few hours that this has been in the public domain, the feedback we've had from clients, from fund managers, from overseas, or even has been absolutely overwhelming. There is huge interest and desire for something like this to come along, and so there's a possibility that even our assessment is a little bit light.
Well, here's the thing, though. Are they buying in or thinking about buying in for the love of rugby? So it's they're spending their money out of love of the game, or are they actually expecting to make something out of this?
We're coming at this purely from an investment perspective. The hard thing to assess would be someone saying, I want to invest because I want to keep the game in New Zealand and I want to own a piece of it just because I love rugby. Our thinking is that this is a really attractive investment proposition.
So what's their forecast returns then?
So, well, our advice is that if rugby was to position this with an initial yield, so a cash gross dividend yield of 5%, that would compare very favourably with, say, money in the bank right now and so on. And that's your starting yield. And given the forecasts of growth in the commercial revenues of rugby, that yield can increase over time. And also, being a listed company, the shares and the performance of those shares could you've got the prospect of those increasing and growing over time as the commercial business grows. So it's an attractive investment thesis.
You have, though, valued the New Zealand Rugby's commercial assets at a much higher level than Silver Lake. So what makes you think you're right about that?
Well, we're in the business of assessing value of entities all the time. We have put a range around it, so it's not a point in, it's not a spot valuation as such. But what we're saying...
No, but potentially you're 23%, according to your own material, 23% higher valuation than Silver Lake.
Yes, and at that level, investors would get around would be getting a 5% initial yield, which is a pretty attractive yield. Now, maybe the shares would get offered at, say, a 5.5% yield. In other words, the total valuation would be a little less than. The Silver Lake yield, as we understand it, is in excess of 6%. So this is a pretty attractive proposition. And what we're saying is we think that the public and fund managers would invest at a level offering an initial yield of 5% with the growth prospects on top of that, and that's why you get a higher valuation than the alternatives.
Okay, so what happens if the shares don't sell?
Well, based on the feedback we've had, we've said we would underwrite the offer.
So what does that mean to average person listening? Yes. What does that mean?
Well, what that means is that when a decision is made to proceed, the underwrite means that they have certainty of the outcome that the offer will proceed. In other words, you have large investors prepared to commit to ensure that the money is raised. So if there is less demand than is being predicted or that sort of thing, then those underwriters would be taking up the shortfall as such. So the Rugby would have the certainty of the proceeds at the point in time they launch the offer to the public.
So they're guaranteed to get this money?
Well, in that sense, yes. That's how underwrites work.
Yeah. It doesn't give them the legacy fund that Silver Lake would enable them to set up, which New Zealand Rugby has said could reach 200 million in that kitty over time. It doesn't.
Yes.
This deal doesn't give them that.
Well, it doesn't give them that up front, but here's two things I'd say about that. One, New Zealand Rugby retains much more of its commercial revenues and therefore has much greater profitability as a business, as an overall business, into the long run versus Silver Lake.
And that's Neil Pavia-Smith, who's from Forsyth Bar. It is almost 21 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Still to come on the program, half-baked, selfish and a distraction. That's the reaction of some provincial rugby unions to the players' proposal. We'll have more after 6. A Robin Hood policy redistributing the big salaries of public service chief executives to lower paid workers would be more effective than the government-ordered pay freeze, according to a leading business academic. The directive, that essentially means those in the public sector earning more than $60,000 will only get a pay rise in exceptional circumstances for the next 3 years, infuriated some workers and prompted crisis meetings between ministers and unions. And it also prompted a rethink and a commitment to review the directive in the next year. The government denies it's a freeze, saying people can still move between pay bands, and it's about equity and raising the wages of workers making 50k or less. And that is 25% of public servants. Now, we'll hear from Dr. Helen Roberts, an Associate Professor at Otago University Business School shortly. But first, Checkpoint takes a peek at the pay slips of some of our highest paid state sector bosses. Here's the payroll roll call, the CEO's edition.
Guardians of New Zealand superannuation, Mr. Matt Winneray, $929,000, following a COVID pay trim. Accident Compensation Corporation, Mr. Scott Pickering, $826,000, down from $852,000 the year before, reflecting part of a voluntary salary cut. Next, Auckland DHB boss Ms. Elsa Clare, $677,000, a COVID haircut noted. Controller and Auditor General John Ryan, $670,000, including a COVID trim. Come on down, Public Service Commissioner Peter Hughes, $630,000. He took a trim too. Financial Markets Authority Kai Whakahaere, Mr. Rob Everett, $623,000. That's 623,000. COVID cut included. Professor Cheryl Della Ray, Canterbury University, $594,000. That's dollars. Let's not forget Mr. Tim Fowler, Tertiary Education Commission, $560,000, including a pay cut. Chief Ombudsman Judge Peter Bosher, $456,000. And Mr. Sid Miller, Earthquake Commission, $437,000, with a temporary pay cut. Jane Doe, Corrections Department Administrator, $45,000. Terms and conditions apply. State Sector Chief Executive Remuneration Disclosure 30 June 2020. Selection random. Pay reductions reflect voluntary temporary 6-month cuts due to unprecedented COVID times. Some pay reductions may span 2 reporting periods. Others aren't captured in this disclosure. Includes union supplied data.
Now, Dr. Helen Roberts is an associate professor in Otago University's Department of Accountancy and Finance, so she knows her way around the calculator. I asked her to put those remuneration packages into perspective.
I've just looked at the data that's out, and it's on the public sector website, so you can go and look yourself. And I looked at the top 5 paid individuals in the state sector who were full term. So there are some people who are new appointments partway through the year, so they don't count. So the top 5 earned $3.882 million between them. So if we break that down, we're talking on average, those 5 individuals took home $776,400 each before tax last year. And if I think about minimum wage, that person's taking home under $40,000 a year, and at the new minimum wage, which just came into effect, that's $41,600. If we look at NZ stats, we're still talking about people earning around either on average $67,000 or a median of $56,000. So there's a big difference there. And, at minimum wage, these people are earning almost 100 times what an individual on minimum wage would be earning.
Are they worth 100 times what a person on the minimum wage is earning?
I guess that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So it depends. It depends what you want out of your workforce. If you just want to pay them based on what the consultant tells you, that's what a person in that position on average is getting paid in that sector, then that's what the Labour Act will do. It will tell you, the minimum criteria that an employer needs to make. I would argue that your baseline employees are worth a lot more than that, and those top-end employees would do just as good a job, but for less money, because they appreciate what they're doing and they have skills and value that they want to add to the organisation that has more value than just the dollar paycheck that they take home.
Is it a fair comparison to do this, to look at the people at the top level of public service and their wages and to compare it at the bottom level? Because, some people might argue they have a different skill set, a higher responsibility, huge stress running these behemoths of ministries, etc. Is it a fair comparison?
I mean, there has to be some incentive to take those roles. I'm not saying that's not the case, but does it need to be more than $500,000 a year? All right, where's the cutoff where it's an acceptable reward for the amount of responsibility and the skill set that you need to do these jobs? They are highly skilled jobs. At the same time, you still need your low-end face-to-face, customer engagement with those people who are working on the ground level. So I think often what happens here is compensation consultants are used to help direct the board around how these pay levels should be set, and the comparison is to look at someone who's working in the private sector, so someone who's in a publicly listed company, employed privately, what do they get paid, and then that becomes a benchmark for our state services sector. But of course there's a big difference in those roles because of the risk that's involved. So in the state sector, you're getting money from the government, you're not facing the risk of bankruptcy or changes in markets or changes in demand. You're not going to have to make a whole lot of people redundant tomorrow. So it's a very different role that you play in the state sector as opposed to a private sector individual. So we can't directly compare those pay levels. And I think that's where we're seeing these very high state sector pay levels coming from.
So, Helen, are you saying that someone working for a private company is worth more because of all the risks that you've just outlined that they have to deal with?
Well, I think we have to incentivise those individuals so that they manage those risks in the best interest of the stakeholders that they represent. However, there's still flaws in the way the pay setting process currently works in New Zealand and in a lot of Western countries, and that is because most of these pay packets are on fixed base level. So when we look at the highest paid individuals, more than half of that money is paid to them in a fixed contract, right? It's a salary. And then there's a small amount, maybe another $100,000, $200,000 that comes through performance incentives. But most of it is fixed. So there is no incentive to do more than you have to. All right, you don't want to upset anyone, but you're going to take away $500,000 regardless.
So those people who have these large remuneration packages, do you believe that a bigger percentage of those packages should be performance-based?
Yes, I do. They should be more linked to performance and less fixed pay. And if you perform well, you meet the objectives of the organisation and the criteria set out in your contract, then you should be rewarded for that achievement.
Given the comparison you have given us between the highest paid and the lowest paid, and talk of a pay freeze, do we sort of need to adopt some kind of Robin Hood policy here where we just shift the money around, take it from the ones at the top and tack it on to the salaries of the one at the bottom?
Well, I think, as idealistic as that sounds, that is one potential solution. You know, I often think to myself, how many times in your lifetime do you need to earn $1 million? You know, most of us would be happy winning lotto once if that was the case. But in the reality of what we're seeing, there's a growing gap between the people who have a lot, like a whole lot, and the people that barely manage to exist, to pay rent, pay electricity, feed their children, and do essential things. One way around that is to redistribute that wealth. So the people who are earning a whole lot, they take some of their pay package and say, let's redistribute that across the lowest paid employees in our company and bring them up so they're at living wage or above that. And that changes the whole culture of the organisation, the respect of individuals within the organisation for each other, and it helps to build a culture where everyone is working for the same goals because everyone's being respected for what they do. People have choices that they can make, and that gives them dignity, and that adds a lot of value to any organisation, public or private.
So does the government need to start a conversation about that?
I think so. And the model has already been used in many different places. It's been very successful. So this is a chance now for us to make a change that can see everybody have a fair income and then spend that money in our economy and grow our GDP.
What's your gut feeling, Helen? Do you see them forming an orderly queue to give up some of their pay packet?
Probably not. But I think it's time that we started that conversation. Think about, rather than just raising minimum wage levels all the time, what is a better way for organisations to remunerate individuals in a transparent way that grows a culture of respect and a common goal towards adding value for stakeholders?
Helen, do you believe redistribution, or beginning the debate about redistribution, is more useful than, well, it's been called a pay freeze, than a pay freeze?
Yeah, I do. I think long-term redistribution has benefits that will far outweigh a pay freeze. A pay freeze makes people angry. It makes people feel like they're not getting rewarded fairly, in the next wage round because nothing's going to change. Redistribution simply means that people who are at the top, who are already well remunerated and have accumulated a lot of wealth, stop and go, I don't need any more money. I would like to see the money that's currently being paid to me apportioned in a way that allows some people who are lower paid in the organisation to gradually improve their take-home pay packet.
And that is Dr. Helen Roberts from Otago University Business School. Homai o whakaaro, you can text us on 2101 with your feedback, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Interested in what you think about state sector CEO pay versus people who are on the lowest salaries, and whether it's a plan to redistribute from the top to the bottom. What are your thoughts? Also, let us know, floating 5% of the All Blacks a stake on the stock exchange. Would you buy in for a minimum of $100, or are they trying to sabotage the Silver Lake deal? Let us know your thoughts on that too. A close friend of David McPhail says he felt his soul go back down through the mattress when he woke to news he had passed away this morning. Actor and writer Peter Rowley worked alongside comedy legends David McPhail and the late John Gadsby throughout his career. He described McPhail not only as a dear friend but a mentor and like a second parent. David McPhail passed away in a Christchurch rest home this morning at the age of 76. Matthew Hutching looks back at his life on and off the screen.
Good evening, I'm Ken Ellis. And I'm David McPhail.
And welcome to A Week Up, the programme that dares to ask the question, why?
And answers, who cares, who knows, and what the hell anyway?
Writer, producer, actor, comedian, beloved husband, father and grandfather. David McPhail was today remembered for bringing satire, like A Week of It, to New Zealand television screens, along with his infamous impersonations of former Prime Minister Sir Robert Muldoon.
Robert Muldoon, you were born in 1920.
That is right, yes, I was a war baby.
But there was no war in 1920.
Oh, there was in our house when my old man first saw me.
Normally in this programme, we'd have some old childhood friends with endearing reminiscences of your boyhood. But according to our researchers, you had no friends.
That's right, yes, not a single friend. I hated them, they hated me, and that's the way I like it.
Speaking only last month to RNZ's Jesse Mulligan about his life, McPhail, who started out as a journalist in 1967, said he was aware the show pushed boundaries and not everyone, including Sir Robert, was a fan of his work.
He didn't like them, but he accepted that they were useful. In fact, that they, and this was one of the problems with the characterization, they humanised him to some extent.
For close friend, comic actor and writer Peter Rowley, his big break came in 1977 when David McPhail heard the then stage manager wanted to actually be on stage.
He rang me at the Court Theatre and said he was putting together a new series called A Week of It, and heard that I could tell good jokes. So he asked me to come in and audition, and I did. And a few days later, he called me back and said that he would like to offer me, to become a member of the core cast of A Week of It.
Peter Rowley described McPhail as his mentor who gave budding actors like him their big break.
I was talking to Mark Hadlow this morning, and he said the same thing, that David was very, very giving, and he wanted the very best out of you. And he did it in such a lovely way. He became a very close friend. Both he and Anne McPhail almost kind of feel like my other parents. They were so giving and loving, and understanding, because I was a bit of a twat when I was younger.
He said despite knowing his friend was very ill, this morning's phone call from Anne McPhail about his friend's passing was still a bolt from the blue.
A man of such stature and iconicness and closeness, it was a jolt when she told me. It was, I felt my soul go back down through the mattress. Yeah, it was a real jolt, and because I loved him, I absolutely loved that man.
David McPhail went on to collaborate with the late John Gadsby on another skit series, McPhail and Gadsby, a working relationship and lifelong friendship that would pan decades. McPhail recalled how they met.
In one of those ridiculous moments in people's lives, two people were at a party together, and one group of people are saying, "You must meet David McPhail, he's very, very funny." Whereas in another part of the room, there's a crowd saying, "You must meet John Gadsby, he's very, very funny." And so you have two potential comedians who are stalking each other around this party, sort of saying, "Okay, make me laugh then." And in fact, he did, and I did, and I hired him first as a writer, because he could obviously write funny scripts.
Also with Peter Rowley and John Gadsby, McPhail made blokey comedy Letter to Blanchie. Years later, he starred in 7 periods with Mr. Gormsby and The Amazing Extraordinary Friends. He was awarded the Queen's Service Medal in 1992, and 16 years later he was appointed an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for his services to television and theatre. Peter Rowley says he's not sure who he's going to collaborate with now that both McPhail and Gadsby are gone.
I'm quite happy to play with my memories, because I don't really do that much acting or anything anymore. And at the moment I'm producing a gin, so the thespian endeavour has driven me to drink, as David once said.
David McPhail passed away this morning peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76. For Checkpoint, Matthew Hutching.
Kia ora e te iwi, Haere nei checkpoint, a Bear Baron's anti-Māori comments fall flat as businesses walk away from the brand. Changes to Kiwisaver could save big bucks, and right now building supplies are hard to nail down. So what does that mean for the housing shortage? Homai o whakaaro, love to hear your feedback on anything you've heard on the program tonight. CEOs pay, the potential, float of a shares in the All Blacks. Let us know your thoughts. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or drop us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines with Susanna.
District health boards insist their offer to nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants is fair and reasonable, despite union claims it won't even cover inflation for most. The nurses' organisation, 30,000 members working in DHBs, have voted to take a one-day strike action next month over their stalled pay negotiations. However, a DHB spokesperson, Jim Green, says their offer is fair and reasonable as it builds on a substantial increase in 2018. The chair of the Northland Rugby Union says a counter-proposal to float part of New NZ Rugby on the stock market is a shameful distraction from the better Silver Lake deal. The Players Association has tabled a counter-offer with investment company Forsyth Barr. The Northland Union's Andrew Ritchie says the original Silver Lake deal ensures a bright future by bringing in money for investment at all levels, including heartland and grassroots clubs. A North Canterbury brewer who made racist comments on a social media post about family violence has said he is extremely sorry for his comments. David Gorn from Eagle Brewing posted a comment on a news website describing Māori as the scourge of New Zealand and says the quicker they were put in jail, the better. His comments have led to some retailers pulling his products from their stores. There is renewed hope that one of the Bay of Plenty's biggest companies will be saved. The Whakatane Mill is due to close at the end of June, but the Eastern Bay of Plenty Economic Development Agency says the mill's owners are in negotiations with the company Smurfit to buy the mill. About half of the seats on a repatriation flight set to leave India for Australia will be left empty after passengers tested positive for COVID-19. The flight had a capacity of just 150 passengers due to social distancing restrictions, but more than 70 will be unable to fly. That includes more than 40 people who tested positive and their close contacts. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It is time for the business news now with Nona Peltier. Nona, manufacturing sector, you have some news on what? That the activity's continuing to expand, but...
Yeah, so we had it every month. We get these numbers, and they're pretty much tell us what's happening now in the economy. And the manufacturing sector last month had a massive expansion, the biggest in history, really, at 63.6. Anything over 50 is expansion. Today, we had a reading of 58.4 for the April month, which is still big, even though it was down on that larger number. And it's driven really by... production and new orders well into that expansion area at 64.5. And these are big, big numbers. But where are those raw materials coming from? The commodity prices are going up. Where's the labor shortages? These are things that are going to cause the industry to worry about inflation creeping in. Inflation could lead to higher interest rates. This is the worry that we had in the United States this week. The Federal Reserve there has said, no, don't worry. We think that we're going to be able to see through that inflation. But there's a big question mark there. That creates some unease.
Who is Elon Musk annoying today?
Oh, he's annoying the same people he was annoying last week with this Dogecoin. That's the doggy one that we talked about.
The cryptocurrency.
That's right. The one that he talked about on Saturday Night Live last week, called it a hustle that caused the currency to drop about 20%. Did I call it a currency? No, it's a token. 20% it dropped. And then this week he started going on about Bitcoin. So he used to accept Bitcoin as a payment for his Tesla vehicles. No longer. He's saying that they're not environmentally friendly enough. And he's going to focus more on helping out the Dogecoin, making it more efficient. Who knows what that means? Anyways, the market regulators are taking a good look at what he's doing because he took them on a wild ride. I mean, the Bitcoin value dropped 21%. And now it's recovered. Now it's only down 15%. And the Dogecoin It took a big dip, 20% down, and then it's recovered a little bit, but goodness knows what's going to happen. Do I want to talk about this every week? You bet you know, because really that's all it deserves.
Okay, well, let's then swiftly move on to the market.
So our own NZX Top 50 Index, which is where real companies trade, it dropped 0.5%, 60 points down to 12,368. That was the 8th consecutive losing session and a 5-week low. The dollar is steady at 71.8 US cents, steady also against the Australian at 92.9 and 51.1 British pence.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business. Disgusted craft beer bars and retailers say they'll no longer stock a Canterbury Brewery's range after its owner posted an anti-Māori rant on social media. The comments from Eagle Brewing owner David Gawn have been strongly condemned by those in the craft beer industry as racist and deplorable. Mr Gawn says he's considering resigning from the Kaiapoi-based brewery and wants to unlearn racial bias and better understand Māori culture. Alicia Foon has the story.
We don't pour beer from racists or bigots, and that's end of the story, really.
That's the reaction of a retailer stocking Eagle Brewing New Zealand after mounting calls to boycott the beer after its owner posted racial remarks online. Operations manager at Auckland's Lumsden Freehouse, Lucy Campbell, says Mr Gawn's comments are horrific and the bar won't be pouring Eagle Brewing's beers again. Matt White owns Beer Jerk, which runs an online craft beer shop and a small bar in Auckland's Eden Terrace.
All of us people in the beer industry know each other. It's a really small community. So some screen grabs of David's comments were shared in some private WhatsApp groups yesterday evening.
He says they won't be placing any more orders with Eagle Brewing on the back of Mr Gawn's comments.
We were just completely flabbergasted. And it's actually, it's almost a visceral, physical feeling of just how sickened we are that somebody can have these feelings and these opinions, and especially in craft beer. So the area that we work in is so accepting and inclusive.
These reactions mirroring the feelings of hundreds of people taken to social media today, calling out the racist remarks. The comment, which has now been deleted, was posted on a Facebook comment section of a story from a news website about a firearms incident near a Napier primary school. It read,
"OK, let's speak the truth. Māori are the scourge of New Zealand. The quicker we put them in prison, the better. I'm talking about the majority of the male population. The ones who beat their missus, who don't give a f*** about society. Yeah, you who will rebel against these words, but truth be told, you are New Zealand's biggest problem right now."
The author, Eagle Brewing director David Gawn. He says he deserves the backlash and agrees what he said was unacceptable.
I'm extremely sorry to the public of New Zealand. The comments as they came across were, absolutely unacceptable, totally inappropriate, and they're not comments I would normally put out there. And it was like I say, it was just a lashing out, I guess. The comments were just totally uncalled for. Didn't really put my point across or the argument across that I was trying to make. Is that I just feel so strongly about family violence.
People are calling for his resignation, something he says he's prepared to do. But he wants to make sure the business doesn't fall over because of him.
I am very, very sorry about the comments, from my heart. And if a resignation is what it takes, then, that will come. But I have to look into that first to make sure that the financial structure of the business stays intact and that is the right thing to do.
At his restaurant, Port and Eagle Brew Pub in Kaiapoi today, there were just 2 staff on and only 3 groups of customers inside. David claims his staff are multicultural, but the front of house staff today were not. Mr Gawn says he fully accepts being called out as a racist.
The wording came across as racist, and I'm not denying that. It was absolutely atrocious, the way it was written. So I think it's absolutely brilliant that people have called it out. And, perhaps I deserve to hurt a wee bit. Perhaps I deserve to hurt a lot, which we are hurting. And I think, the business will continue to hurt for a while. This whole thing has made me look at myself. Just ask the question, who am I? Who's the real David? Who's the real person inside? It's just made me think, I need to be better. I need to be better than this.
He says his apology will be followed up with action and asks RNZ to follow his journey to unlearn racial bias.
And I think I need to, unlearn any sort of bias I have or any cultural, misinformation. I need to unlearn all that. And what I need to do is, going forward, is, try to learn from these cultures and immerse myself more. I've already started asking questions from some of my Maori friends who have come to me and said, "Hey, Dave, this is not you. This is not what you are. What's going on?"
She Is Not Your Rehab founders Matt and Sarah Brown of the anti-violence movement aiming to break cycles of domestic violence spoke to RNZ News and say they wish to meet with David, kanohi ke te kanohi, face to face, so that he can gain understanding and compassion for the people he's offended and which they happen to work alongside. For Checkpoint, ko Elisha Foon tēnei.
It is about 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. He muriaki in a pita kōrero after the news at 6, driving the change to electric cars and offering shares in the All Blacks. What do the provincial unions reckon? Well, a lot of you have got in touch about, the rugby and also CEO pay in the state sector. Let's start with rugby. This listener says, yes, and yes. I'm a grandma, hardly ever watch rugby, but I sure as hell would buy a few $100 shares in them. Another listener says, don't sell it to the Yanks. Look at what they've done to New Zealand Rail. And Linda says, the big boys at New Zealand Rugby don't seem to understand that without the All Blacks, they wouldn't have a job. Daniel's also got in touch, says the Green Bay Packers of the United States National Football League long ago floated a public offering. It is part of why they are one of the most popular teams in the sport, he says, and cemented multi-generational fan engagement. Nothing engages fans like owning a piece of the team, where it's selling 12% of shares when the profit margin is below 12% is a losing deal, says Daniel. On the subject of CEO pay, lots of feedback on this one. Someone has said to us, imagine the savings the government will make getting rid of 21 CEOs from the DHBs. Another person says a good CEO can lift the performance of tens or hundreds in the team. Look at Mainfreight for a great example of a CEO who is worth more than he is paid. Michael's got in touch to say, I'm a nurse practitioner. I've been at the top of my grade, hitting the glass ceiling for the last 5 to 7 years. I'm just over 100,000 per annum, so it looks like I will not be getting any sleep, a recognition, even given the fact that the senior level of my nursing skills and experience. Another one says the average teacher does 4 years of study and deals with mammoth levels of stress daily, and teachers get paid very low, for example, compared to Australia. And these CEOs are milking it. But another person says that that's how we attract good talent from overseas. And if we don't offer significant pay packages, we won't be competitive and we won't get the most experienced people. Keep your feedback coming, 2101 on the text or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. The government's announced big changes to the Kiwisaver scheme, which it hopes will give people better bang for its buck. From December, the number of default providers, those allocated to new Kiwisaver members who don't actively select their fund, will be slashed from 9 to 6. Here's political reporter Katie Scotcher.
27-year-old Logan doesn't pay much attention to his Kiwisaver fund.
Zero thought into that.
He got a letter from his bank last week suggesting he moved from a default account.
Nah, mate, you throw that away. You do a brisk read and then you go, I've got better things to do, and you put that to the side.
Logan was blissfully unaware of the high Kiwisaver program fees banks have been charging.
Things you don't know about can't hurt you, So I didn't know what was going on, so it didn't bother me.
Regardless of how much attention people pay to their Kiwisaver, the Finance Minister says they deserve better bang for their buck. He says the big changes to the Kiwisaver scheme announced today will achieve that. The government's cut the number of default Kiwisaver providers from 9 to 6 and has banned them from making investments in fossil fuels. It's also changed the base investment people will be put into from conservative to balanced fund.
I think and I hope that this will lead to a greater level of competition and that will lead to a lowering of fees.
6 companies have been appointed default providers: BNZ, Booster, Westpac, Kiwi Wealth, Simplicity and Smart Shares. Consumer Affairs Minister David Clark explains what this will mean for people joining the scheme.
Default provider will still be provided, so the process is exactly the same. Obviously, I think the news today will encourage more people to look at their funds overall and make an active choice about where they put their money.
This is a first for Simplicity and Smart Shares, run by share market operator NZX. Smart Shares Chief Executive Hugh Stevens says it's not yet clear to what extent the default status will grow its business.
It's a scale game, so what that means is that really we need to demonstrate that we're the best option for a very large number of New Zealanders. So time will tell. I think really we want to show that I suppose it doesn't need to be expensive to start putting away a bit of money for the future and starting to make plans for your financial well-being.
The companies that haven't had their default status renewed are AMP, ANZ, ASB, Fisher Funds and Mercer. Their contracts end in November and the new ones kick in December. Paul Gregan from the Financial Markets Authority expects roughly 380,000 default users will make the transition.
But the change, as I say, is we think a good one, so worthwhile.
As for 27-year-old Logan, he's quietly chuffed.
It just tells me that you don't care about things and eventually they'll get better.
Atu i te whare parimata mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scott Churaho.
An 82-year-old Matamata man has been given home detention over the attempted murder of his wife in a suicide pact. Roy Morton pleaded guilty in the High Court in Hamilton and has been sentenced to 4.5 months home detention. Our reporter Andrew McRae was in court.
Morton was distressed by his wife's condition after she suffered a debilitating stroke and didn't believe she was being well looked after. He says they agreed to a suicide pact as she wanted to end her life. Morton tried twice to carry out the pact, but failed. His lawyer Roger Laybourne says he now accepts his wife didn't have the capacity to enter into a suicide pact. He says his client loves his wife deeply.
82-year-old, married to his wife for over 57 years, confronted with the unexpected tragedy of severe stroke and losing his companion in the golden years that they were looking forward to.
The court heard that as a result of the stroke, Mrs. Morton, who's 81, suffered significant physical, mental and cognitive disabilities and was unable to communicate. Justice Davison says she has difficulties retaining and understanding information and displays signs of reasoning. He says Morton clearly had a deep emotional connection with his wife.
You told the probation officer that despite her disability and as a result of her stroke, you believe that your wife nevertheless communicated with you in a non-verbal way by means of gestures. You say that at one point your wife used language from which you understood her to be saying that she wished to end her life.
The judge didn't agree.
The court does not accept and cannot accept your explanation that there was communication or meaningful communication from Mrs. Morton that provided any reasonable or justifiable basis for your belief that there was a joint suicide pact.
Justice Davison set a starting point of 18 months jail, but reduced that by taking into account the guilty plea, his age and health, and genuine remorse. He says there were 2 aggravating factors.
Namely, your premeditation and Mrs. Morton's vulnerability. Your actions were carefully planned and obviously premeditated.
Speaking after the sentencing, lawyer Roger Laybourne describes it as compassionate.
I'm always left with the feeling that the law is a bad fit for these particular actions, because when you have somebody who acts out of love and then is charged with attempted murder, it doesn't seem to compute. Whether or not that means there needs to be an examination of some alternative charge, that's probably for other people to look at.
Roy Morton says his wife was and is completely coherent.
As we drove there,
she had my phone on her lap like she normally does, because she doesn't like me having the phone when I'm driving. And I said to her, you do know the police can track us with that phone. And she immediately threw the phone out the window. So she's completely coherent. I've got video recordings of her talking to me.
He says his wife is doing okay.
She won't improve. She's not expected to improve, but she's just a beautiful mind trapped in her body. It's no use to her, and she's just cries a lot. She gets very upset. Yeah, she's still suffering, but we're going to get over that, and I hope one day she'll be able to come home to me, because I need her far more than she needs me.
Morton says he's very happy now with the care his wife's receiving. For Checkpoint, Ko Andrew McRae-Tene.
Now to Dunedin, where Trans-Tasman Super Rugby will make a return for the first time since mid-March last year, when the season was canned due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight, the Highlanders host the Queensland Reds under the roof at Forsyth Bar Stadium. Our Otago Southland reporter Timothy is at the ground and is joining us now. Timothy, what's the atmosphere like there?
Kia ora, Lisa. Well, to be honest, there's not a lot of atmosphere at the moment. We are still a few minutes away from the gates opening, and we are an hour away from kick-off. But it's a freezing cold night in Dunedin. There's a bit of southerly sweeping through, and I think that's keeping plenty of the punters away, which is a shame, because this will probably shape up to be the game of the round. You've got the Reds, who won the Australian competition last week. You've got the Highlanders, who finished second from the bottom, but showed how good they are by knocking off the Crusaders at one stage. It's shaping up to be a good match. How many are here to see it? That's the question that remains.
Yeah, so are there any predictions around whether it's going to be a sellout or not?
I haven't got crowd numbers, but I can confidently say it's not going to be a sellout. I was having a look at tickets before, and you can still buy rows of 10 tickets in most of the areas of the stadium. I mean, the Take a Kid to Footy stand is packed out, so all the young ones are here. I can hear plenty of kids' voices in the background screaming and yelling. But other than that, the stadium is looking a bit patchy at best.
So you're hardier than most, are you, Tim? You said there's probably not great weather coming, but, you know, are you keen? You out there for the duration?
Well, I won't be watching the game in the stadium tonight. I will be watching at home where it's warm and safe. But I can remember that when we had the return of Super Rugby Aotearoa in June last year, it was an equally cold night. But this ground was heaving. The city was buzzing. It just doesn't seem to be the same. And if there's any Queenslanders in Dunedin, I don't know where they are. Not that I can blame them. I'd probably prefer to be in the Sunshine Coast right now as well.
Thanks, Timothy. Have a wonderful evening watching from the comfort of your warm home. That is Timothy Brown, our Otago Southland reporter. Let's stick with the rugby theme. More of your feedback on the proposal by the Players Association to float some shares in the All Blacks. This person says not interested in rugby, but would cheerfully pay $100 to keep ownership in New Zealand. As a country, we sell too much to overseas interests. Judy says beaut idea that shares would be available to New Zealanders, but how would we be sure that there is not large overseas share purchases that would give strong offshore shareholders voting rights, says Judy. Nita says her only income is super, but she'd pay for a bit of the All Blacks.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata with DNA. District health boards insist their offer to nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants is fair and reasonable, despite union claims it won't even cover inflation for most. The nurses' organisation's 30,000 members working in DHBs have voted to take a one-day strike action next month over their stalled pay negotiations. However, a DHB spokesperson, Jim Green, says he's confident a resolution can be reached with mediation planned for early next week.
Our offer really builds on the substantial increases that were made for nurses in the last round of negotiations. And also we're very mindful of the fact that there's a pay equity settlement that we are in the latter stages of working through with the nurses on. So that's another factor.
Jim Green says the pay equity settlement for midwives will be finished by the end of the year and backdated to the end of 2019. An investment services company claims its proposal to list part of New Zealand Rugby on the stock market carries less risk than an alternative plan. Forsyth Bar says selling 5% of NZR's revenue gathering assets via the stock exchange will also deliver up to $191 million. Under a deal with US investment firm Silver Lake, NZR would receive nearly $400 million. But the managing director of Forsyth Bar, Neil Pavois-Smith, believes that listing is a better idea.
This is an opportunity for New Zealand Rugby to retain a greater proportion of the ownership of their commercial revenues into the future. Alongside that, giving all New Zealanders an opportunity to own a slice of New Zealand Rugby is a really attractive investment proposition.
Neil Pavier-Smith says the Forsyth Bar proposal puts rugby in a far stronger position. Builders around the country are having to wait months to get materials. They say the problem's getting worse. Our reporter Tom Kitchen has more.
A whangarei builder was told he'd have to wait 15 to 20 weeks for some products. This leaves houses unfinished for months when the country's facing an emergency housing crisis. The amount of time it takes to move material from ports has also increased dramatically. It used to take 3 days to get a crate of materials from a ship in Tauranga onto a truck or train to get to Auckland. It now takes 15. The building industry is calling on the government to work with it to fix the supply issues. It argues there needs to be more investment in road, rail and ports. Ko Tom Kitchener.
The Transport Minister says New Zealanders must ditch their reliance on petrol and diesel cars to meet emissions targets. Michael Wood unveiled a Ministry of Transport report today discussing options for how New Zealand could reduce its emissions to zero by 2015.
We're going to deal with some tough issues. We're going to need to change the way that we move around our country. Issues such as the question of whether we need to go down the route of road pricing to send a clear signal about the costs of using our roads and incentivise people to use public transport, walk and cycle.
Transport makes up about half of the country's emissions. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has told police they must be prepared to use a lot of force to quell street violence between Jews and Arab Israelis. There are reports of further acts of violence in mixed Jewish-Arab cities and towns. The BBC's Paul Adams has the details.
There is every sign that militants on both sides, and we're talking mostly about gangs of youths, Jewish groups and Arab groups, seem bent on grabbing people out of their cars, beating them up, attacking houses and so forth. The Israeli security presence in these towns and areas has been beefed up considerably. There has been the mobilisation of several hundred paramilitary border guards. Now, they're normally seen on duty in Palestinian territories, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's unusual for them to be deployed on the streets of Israel itself.
Writer, actor and comedian David McPhail, a pioneer of TV satire in New Zealand, has died aged 76. David McPhail was best known for his impression of former Prime Minister Robert Muldoon. His son Matt McPhail says he died overnight in his sleep after a heart attack. Matt McPhail says it was a privilege to be his son.
Not a day goes by or has gone by that someone doesn't say to me, "Oh, I knew your father," or "I worked with your father," or "I watched your father." You know, yeah, an absolute privilege. And I don't think it's until I've got older that I realised how significant he was really to the country. I mean, he was just my father and always was.
David McPhail rose to prominence in the 1970s, creating popular TV shows, A Week of It, McPhail and Gadsby, alongside John Gadsby, bringing satire to New Zealand's TV screens. Staff at Christchurch's Orana Wildlife Park are mourning the loss of Mahali, the gorilla. The 12-year-old has been unwell for the past 2 weeks, and an ultrasound revealed a large abnormal growth in his abdomen. His health declined in recent days and he died today. The park says Mahali was part of a group of 3 gorillas that came from Sydney's Taronga Zoo as part of the international breeding program. It's 6:05. A frenetic first half is what the Highlanders have in store for the Super Rugby Australia champions, the Queensland Reds, when the Trans-Tasman competition kicks off in Dunedin tonight. All Blacks and Highlanders, halfback Aaron Smith, believes the home side has several advantages, but to make the most of those, they need to play at a fast pace.
We've got to get them on the stadium and run them round. They're a good team, but, we've got to really take advantage of, for them, a short week, coming off a final, a big campaign, and we've had 10 days off. We've got to show them in that first 20 what we're about.
In tonight's other match, the Hurricanes play the Waratahs in Sydney. New Zealand batsman Devon Conway hopes sprinkling kitty litter on practice wickets might help him prepare for India's spin bowlers ahead of the World Test Cricket Championship final next month. The bulk of the New Zealand side leave for the UK this weekend for 2 tests against England and the Championship final. Conway, who's in line to make his test debut, hopes playing the ball off kitty litter might help prepare for the variation of spin. New Zealand play the first test against England in London on June the 2nd. Shot putter Tom Walsh says he needs to be competing against the best in the world again if he's to have any chance of winning in Tokyo. Walsh leaves the country this weekend, not having competed internationally since the 2019 World Champs. He now has competitions lined up in the United States and Europe over the next few weeks. That's the news.
One night, 10 bars, 20 experts. This one is talking about undercover policing and the law.
If you ask a cop if they're a cop, they have to say yes.
Not
is that
true.
a true thing?
No.
Thank you.
Every one of these cases shows, that is absolutely not true.
Join Associate Law Professor Scott Optican for the first highlight of Auckland University's Raising the Bar series. Smart Talk, 4 p.m. Sunday on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Net Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Cloud increasing, a few showers in Northland, then rain with heavy falls spreading east overnight, becoming mainly fine tomorrow morning or afternoon. For the remainder of the North Island, high cloud increasing, rain for most parts tomorrow morning, then mainly fine, with isolated showers in the west until the evening. Marlborough and Nelson, mainly fine tonight, rain with heavy falls developing, then clearing tomorrow morning. Bulla to Fiordland, also Southland and Clutha, mainly fine but drizzle about Fiordland. Rain with heavy falls developing everywhere this evening, easing to a few showers tomorrow morning. For the remainder of Otago and Canterbury, mainly fine, scattered rain tonight and tomorrow morning. A few showers around eastern Otago tomorrow evening. Chatham Islands, a few showers, a period of rain tomorrow afternoon and evening. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. No mai hoki mai. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Allegations of sabotage, half-baked ideas, shameful distractions and leading the public down the proverbial garden path. Some provincial rugby unions and New Zealand Rugby have hit out hard at a proposal being floated by the Players Association as an alternative to the Silver Lake deal. The Silver Lake deal would see the US equity firm buy 12.5% of NZR's commercial rights for about $400 million. The Players plan, backed by investment firm Forsyth Barr, could see a smaller 5% stake floated on the stock exchange. South Canterbury Rugby Chief Executive Craig Calder has 2 key questions.
What benefit is it to us? Right down in grassroots, and how are they going to raise this money? And to me, the missing equation of all these discussions is Silver Lake, and it's what Silver Lake brings to the party, and that is just huge. You know, you've got a global market, all the technology advances they've got, and the knowledge and the IP. That's what this deal is all about, in my mind.
So, what do you think the players' motivation is with this then?
Oh, nothing but money. And I say that very sincerely. It's nothing but money. They are looking at 20 million more per year over the next 5 years. That's 100 million that's actually not going to grassroots rugby. It's going to the players. And yes, I should share in the increased revenues that we get, and it's equitably, but I'm just questioning their motive.
So they have released this document publicly today and sent it to all the provincial unions. What do you make of that move?
Oh, it stinks, to be honest. It was all in good faith up until today. I understand from the communications I've had from New Zealand Rugby that they were going back into mediation and they were going to discuss different mediation behind closed doors. Then they go and release it in public. What is their motive? What are they trying to do by doing this? Why can't we have a secretive negotiations going on? It's just not good for New Zealand Rugby as a whole.
What's the harm with putting it out there so the public can see what's going on?
Because the unions hadn't seen it up until just before midday today.
And so why not release it, give the union a couple of hours to look at it and then put it out for the public to see what the proposal is?
Yeah, that's fine from the New Zealand Players Association because they've released a lot of information that we have never seen before and don't know about, and they're just releasing this. Why couldn't they consult with us on it? Why just push a paper forward, why not leave it to mediation?
So will you give this any consideration, or are you ruling it outright?
Oh, that's not for me to decide. I'm only one of 26 provincial unions, and I represent South Canterbury. It really is up to New Zealand Rugby, and then they'll make recommendations, obviously, back to all the provincial unions.
But you have already rubber-stamped the Silver Lake deal, right? Is there any possibility that you will look at this and walk back your support for Silver Lake in terms of your union?
In our union, I couldn't see it happening. We just see the massive benefits and the global benefits that the Silver Lake deal will bring us.
This deal from the Players Association would give the provinces the same amount as the Silver Lake deal, they say, $39 million, and also the same capital contribution into the commercial company that's being set up. So why isn't it as good as Silver Lake?
Well, the figures may stack up, but where's the IP? I keep going back and saying, where are we going to get the commercial knowledge from that Silver Lake will bring to, and their family of companies that they belong to and own. You know, where's all that?
And that was South Canterbury Rugby Chief Executive Craig Calder, and we've had a lot of feedback on this subject. This listener says, great idea for the public to buy shares in the All Blacks. Let's do it. Michael says, the Rugby Players Association seems to have forgotten what the major benefit of the Silver Lake deal is, besides the capital injection, which is Silver Lake's access to international viewing rights deals. I can't see mum and dad investors being able to do that. Ngā mihi, says Michael. Thank you for your feedback. And this one says there's no way New Zealand Rugby should sign up to a deal where the investor gets a share of the revenue. This means a complete misalignment of incentives. Back to the table on that proposal and have an alternative like local listing to make sure New Zealand Rugby is in a good negotiation position. And another listener says, if Silver Lake believes New Zealand Rugby was worth putting money into, they could always buy shares in a sports company that has potentially been valued at 23% more than what Silver Lake valued it at. Absolutely keep New Zealand Rugby in New Zealand. And that seems to be your overwhelming message so far this evening. At least 1 in 5 New Zealanders need to be driving an electric car in the next 15 years. And almost all buses and thousands of trucks need to run on batteries if we're to meet our emissions targets. And as much as possible, people need to get out of their cars completely. And the Minister of Transport warns if New Zealand doesn't move quickly, it risks becoming a dumping ground for other countries' dirty vehicles. Alice Stewart reports.
The Hikina Te Kohu Paru report may not be government policy, but the start of a conversation asking how the heck do we get transport to net zero emissions in the next 30 years. Transport Minister Michael Wood says reducing emissions is the biggest issue of our time, morally and politically.
Eliminating emissions across the transport sector and meeting the recommendations of the Independent Climate Commission will be an enormous undertaking, but it is achievable and it can help us with our economic recovery. Reaching our goal of net zero carbon by 2050 will unclog our cities, clean up our air, support the creation of new businesses and low-carbon industries, and create sustainable jobs across our country.
Agriculture and industry need decarbonising to meet the goal, but transport, the Minister says, is by far the fastest growing polluter.
The transport sector currently produces 47% of CO2 emissions. And between 1990 and 2018, domestic transport emissions increased by 90%.
With other countries having moved faster on electric vehicles, he says New Zealand's falling behind.
We have countries around the world, the United Kingdom, for example, where we already have close to 30% of new sales being EVs, parts of Scandinavia where it's well over 50%, major car companies around the world that are literally stopping making internal combustion engines. So the world is shifting in this direction, and the faster we do it, the better, because if we don't do it, we will become the dumping ground for the dirtiest vehicles as those other countries transition. So I think it's an area in which we do need a higher level of ambition, and as government will bring in the policies to support that transition.
Hikina Te Kohu Para details 4 options with varying emphasis on different changes, all getting to carbon zero in 30 years.
The pathways show that it is possible to meet our emissions reduction targets, but that there will need to be big changes coming in the years ahead and the decades ahead. Hikina sets out a clear strategy for how we can reduce emissions by building cities and towns in which we avoid the need to emit as we live, work and play. By supporting people to have real transport choices so that people can shift from being dependent on their cars all the time to using public transport, walking or cycling around their communities.
Michael Wood says it will take bold changes. Some of these may be unpopular, but he says the majority of people know we cannot keep living the same way as we have if we want a future for our children and their children.
I am calling for a mature conversation with an eye on our shared future, not on the partisan politics of the day.
There are no costings on any of these pathways as yet. The government must finalise an emission reductions plan by the end of the year to meet the Climate Change Commission's carbon budget. A large part of this around transport. Mo te hotaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Alice Stewart tēnei.
The conflict rages on. Israel has deployed tanks and troops to the border with Gaza. Israeli Defence Forces say they have intensified their assault on the Gaza Strip, but ground troops have not entered the territory. Palestinian militants, Hamas, fired a volley of rockets into Israel, while the Israeli army continued a barrage of airstrikes. More than 100 people in Gaza have been killed and 7 in Israel. Tension is now spilling over and there are increasing clashes across the country in mixed Jewish and Arab Israeli towns and cities, amid warnings of a civil war. The BBC's Jeremy Bowen reports from Jerusalem.
Palestinian families are fleeing their homes in northern Gaza this evening. They told the BBC they were escaping heavy Israeli shell fire. Dozens of civilians were killed in their area in the 2014 war, so they left in a hurry, with their children still in the new clothes they're given for the end of Ramadan. One man said, the criminal occupation shows them no mercy. A renewal of the war between Hamas and Israel was always likely. The unexpected front line on the streets of Israel was not. Sectarian violence between Israeli citizens brings a new and vicious dimension. Not all Israelis are Jews, around 20% are Palestinian Arabs. Young men have been on the prowl for people to attack. Jews versus Arabs, Arabs against Jews, all Israeli citizens. Israel's president warned that the country should not abandon itself to civil war. As for the other war, it was a day for decisions. Among the Hamas leaders assassinated by Israel this week were top commanders. Will that deter another escalation? Probably not. Israel has to decide whether it wants to follow artillery and air attacks with a ground assault against Hamas inside Gaza. That has been part of the pattern during 15 years of intermittent warfare between them. Israel has called up 7,000 reservists.
And that was Jeremy Bowen reporting. It is almost 20 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. New Zealand's COVID crown is slipping and we're running out of time to make the most of it. That's what Sir Peter Gluckman told a business conference in Auckland today, where the vaccine rollout and attracting high-skilled workers were discussed. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern also spoke at the event called Auckland's Future Now, which also saw discussion on how the city can navigate the economic challenges of the pandemic. Our reporter Jean Bell was there.
Former Chief Science Advisor Peter Gluckman says New Zealand's COVID-free status is rapidly losing appeal as the rest of the world rolls out the vaccine and resumes normal travel. It means New Zealand is running out of time to attract high-skilled workers to fill shortages.
The window of opportunity for New Zealand to attract talent is evaporating rather rapidly as the developed world becomes vaccinated. Many Asian countries are now on an aggressive hunt for that talent.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is hinting that an immigration announcement next week will be music to the ears of business leaders crying out for high-skilled workers.
We want to shift the balance away from low-skilled, low-paid work towards attracting high-skilled migrants and addressing genuine skill shortages in order to improve productivity.
She says the changes will also aim to attract international investment. In the meantime, she is pointing to a strong uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine as a vital part of the country's economic recovery.
If the most significant thing we can do to help our recovery is reconnect to the world, the most significant factor affecting our ability to do that will ultimately be vaccine uptake.
Auckland Mayor Phil Goff says the region faces additional challenges as the gateway into Aotearoa, New Zealand.
We've had 28 days longer at level 3 than the rest of the country. We've had 26 days longer at level 2 than the rest of the country, and we continue to face higher risks and higher costs because of this.
He says while unemployment is lower than first feared, the economic crunch has aggravated inequities, particularly for Māori and Pacifica. Meanwhile, Peter Gluckman says clear strategy is needed to make the most of the super city.
West Auckland could be our Hollywood. Why do we not place tertiary education and communication and entertainment out there rather than in central Auckland? South Auckland is full of distinct social and creative innovation. How can that be leveraged and so forth?
He says the city needs to be more ambitious in planning and embracing futuristic infrastructure and services.
Urban farming, smart grids, autonomous vehicles, digital services that reach everyone, remote education and health, all of these are part of the mix of a mid-21st century smart city.
Mō te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko Jeanbao tēnei.
Builders are having to wait nearly half a year to get supplies and say it's getting worse. It's putting strain on finishing projects at a time when New Zealand desperately needs more homes. Our reporter Tom Kitchen has more.
In Whangarei, builder Roland Mosley isn't having much luck planning ahead. He recently went into a building supply store and asked for James Hardie products. James Hardie's the largest global supplier of fibre cement material. But he was told he'd have to wait 15 to 20 weeks.
I think it's getting worse rather than better. It's really the first time that the Hardys or various suppliers have admitted that they've got this sort of delay. Normally you just order it and hope, but now they're actually giving a timeline that is that far out.
Mr Mosley says this brings more and more delays.
You sort of do as far as you can on one job and then you hit the wall because you haven't got whatever it is and you move to the other one and do what you can there, and it's about all you can do. Can't put stuff up that we can't get.
Building Industry Federation CEO Julian Lays agrees it's getting worse. He says it's an issue all over the country.
We are seeing ongoing shortages at a time when the demand is showing no signs of lessening. So there are still people that are needing to build, wanting to build it in both residential and commercial.
It's not just the big stuff. He says there's a lot that builders can't find.
The materials that they depend on, everything from fasteners, square washers, power tools, vanity tops, ladders, all those things, even door handles, are not coming into the country.
Baypack in Napier supplies building accessories. Account manager Lucian Redman says if builders can't get materials, he might see a decline in hand-in-hand product sales.
For example, if there's no framing going up, then your James Hardie RAB board isn't being stuck on, then we aren't selling the flashing tapes or the vent strips and everything else that goes in with that, and then your cladding's then put on hold, and the flow-on effects of that is dramatic.
Tumu Group, based in Hastings, supplies timber over the North Island. It also runs a Tumu group of ITM stores on the East Coast. Director Barry O'Sullivan says the timber shortage is brought on by both supply and demand, and it's not all COVID's fault.
In recent years, there's been a lot of rationalisation with sawmill closures, which has limited supply. But on top of that, there's unprecedented demand and a lot of building and construction going on.
Julian Lays of the Builders Industry Federation says everyone's got to pitch in to solve the problem.
It is a serious problem. I think we all need to get our heads together on this, and I think industry needs to work with government, and we need to find a way of collectively just dealing with this ongoing logistics supply issue and also investing more into our road and rail infrastructure and ports.
One of the biggest problems in Aotearoa is a growing social housing waitlist. Many Kiwis are living in emergency accommodation, and some are overrun with crime, such as in Rotorua. Some say the solution's obvious: build more houses. But when the demand for houses far outstrips the supply of building materials, the question remains: when can enough houses be built? Mo te hōtaka o te yahiyahi ko Tom Kitchener.
A milestone for the fully vaccinated in America. There's no longer any need to wear masks or social distance indoors, except for certain circumstances. The Centre for Disease Control and Prevention made the announcement, saying it's a moment everyone has been longing for. CNN's Caitlin Collins has the details.
It's a good day for the country.
For the fully vaccinated, the masks are coming off.
I think it's a great milestone, a great day.
President Biden touting new CDC guidance that vaccinated people no longer need to wear a mask or social distance, even if they're inside.
If you are fully vaccinated, you no longer need to wear a mask.
The president framing the new guidance as an incentive.
Get vaccinated or wear a mask until you do.
Modeling the new guidance moments after it was issued, Biden entered the Rose Garden sans mask.
And you got a great smile.
CDC Director Rochelle Walensky announced the milestone that many have been waiting for.
We have all longed for this moment. If you are fully vaccinated, you can start doing the things that you had stopped doing because of the pandemic.
Biden was meeting with a group of Republican senators in the Oval Office when the news broke, and all shed their masks accordingly.
We had our masks off.
Moments later, the White House told staffers who are fully vaccinated they can also take off their mask while on the complex.
And that report was from CNN's Caitlin Collins. Get a jab and become a millionaire. That's what will happen for 5 lucky people in the US state of Ohio. Republican Governor Mike DeWine's launched a lottery draw for people who've had at least 1 dose, as vaccination rates across the country slow. But the plan has been slammed by Democrats and Republicans as a waste of money. The BBC's Gary O'Donoghue has more.
3, 2, 1, vaccinate!
Yeah! Ohio is keeping up with average vaccination rates around the country, but the Governor, Mike DeWine, wants to do more. So, starting on May the 26th, all Ohioans who've had at least 1 shot will be entered into a special weekly draw. And for 5 weeks, 1 lucky individual will be $1 million to the good. The under-18s will also not be left out. For them, there will be a similar draw, the prize for which will be 4 years of college tuition fees, plus board and lodging with books thrown in. Mike DeWine attempted to head off any criticism.
Now, I know that some of you now are shaking your head and say, that Mike DeWine, he's crazy. This $1 million drawing idea of yours is a waste of money. The real waste, when the vaccine is readily available to anyone who wants it, is a life that is lost now.
Like many states, Ohio has seen its take-up of vaccines slow sharply in recent weeks, with only 36% of the population fully immunised to date. Other governors and businesses have also come up with incentives, including tickets to sports games and, in New Jersey, a free beer with your shot.
Gary O'Donoghue with that report. And a bit of your feedback before we head off. On the state sector pay and the pay of CEOs, this person's not happy, all in capital letters. For goodness sake, $500,000 a year in state sector is insane. It's public work, not private. Hello. Even our top responsibility job, our Prime Minister, only gets paid $470,000. And that bloody damn top guy in Auckland Watercare was on about $870K with his extras. He got more than Jacinda! ! That is just insane, says that person. Don't forget, you can catch up on all our stories online. Have a wonderful weekend. Catch you on Monday.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. DHBs insist their offer to nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants is fair and reasonable, despite their union saying it won't even cover inflation for most. An investment services company says its proposal to list part of NZ Rugby on the stock market carries less risk than an alternative plan. Israel's Prime Minister has told police they must be prepared to use a lot of force to quell street violence between Jews and Arab Israelis. A Hawke's Bay builder says a perfect storm is leading to delays in building projects being finished. Our next